Marcus Williams moved into the neighborhood he designed himself, but the neighbors did everything to make him feel like an outsider. When disaster threatened their comfort, he was the only one who could save their homes. What happened next will surprise even the most skeptical. But first, let's start from the beginning. Marcus Williams stood at the gates of his new home, taking a deep breath of the cool morning air and savoring the tranquility of the neighborhood. Silver Oaks looked like something straight out of a luxury magazine. Neatly trimmed lawns, perfect facades of mansions with tall columns, and gleaming high-end cars in the driveways. It seemed there was no place here for disorder, noise, or anything that might disrupt the carefully crafted perfection. But the moment Marcus stepped inside the gates, he sensed that this tranquility was just an illusion. A subtle movement behind the neighbor's hedge caught his eye. A woman in an elegant silk robe, holding a champagne glass, stood on the porch of the house across the street. Her eyes narrowed and her lips curled into a thin, almost imperceptible smirk. She whispered something to her husband, a gray-haired man in an expensive suit. Marcus saw the man nod curtly, gripping a fresh copy of the local newspaper tightly, his gaze cold and unwavering. "Can I help you?" came a voice filled with icy indifference. Marcus turned slowly. Standing before him was the same man, his suit impeccably pressed, his face a mixture of disapproval and curiosity. "Good afternoon. I'm your new neighbor," Marcus said, extending his hand with a calm smile. The man didn't move. He didn't even glance at Marcus's outstretched hand. Instead, his gaze swept over him, as if assessing whether Marcus was even worth acknowledging. "We have a certain standard of residence here," the man finally said, his voice low and detached. "I hope you understand this isn't a neighborhood for ordinary people." Marcus felt a tightness build in his chest, but he knew any sign of emotion would only escalate the situation. His fingers slowly curled into a fist, but his smile remained unchanged. "I'm sure we'll get along just fine," he replied calmly. "I have big plans for this neighborhood." A flicker of confusion crossed the man's face, but before he could respond, the roar of an engine echoed through the street. A sleek, black SUV pulled up to the curb and outstepped another man, tall, with commanding features and a smug smile. It was Harold Baxter, the chairman of the local homeowners association. He adjusted the cuffs of his expensive shirt and approached, scrutinizing Marcus with an air of superiority. "Welcome, Mr. Williams, is it?" he said, pronouncing the name as if it left a bitter taste in his mouth. "We should have a conversation about some of our community rules." Marcus resisted the urge to roll his eyes. He recognized the tone, thinly veiled hostility masked as polite concern. "Of course," he replied evenly. Baxter smirked, folding his arms across his chest. "You see, we have a close-knit community here. We've known each other for years, and we value our exclusivity." His voice dripped with condescension. "I'm sure you understand how important it is to maintain the right atmosphere." Marcus felt the weight of unseen eyes watching him. Some neighbors peeked through their windows, others pretended to prune hedges or walk their dogs. But all were observing intently, waiting to see if he would crumble under the pressure of their silent opposition. "I'm sure I'll enjoy it here," Marcus said, meeting Baxter's gaze head-on. "I have a lot of ideas to improve the neighborhood, and I'm sure you'll love them." A brief silence followed, then a soft chuckle. Baxter stepped back and shook his head. "We'll be watching you, Williams," he said, then turned to the suited man beside him. "Let's go, George. We have an important meeting to attend." They walked away, leaving Marcus standing there, jaw clenched in restrained frustration. He took a deep breath and looked up at his new house. The tall windows reflected the setting sun, and in that glow, he didn't just see a house. He saw a symbol of his perseverance and his right to be here. "All right," he muttered to himself, stepping inside. "Let's see how long they can ignore me." But he had no idea how far they would go to keep him out. A week had passed since Marcus moved in, and he had already realized he was an outsider, not because of his financial status. His wealth allowed him to live in Silver Oaks on par with the rest. No, his skin color spoke louder than his bank account. The neighbors seemed to consciously avoid him. When he went out for a morning jog on the perfectly paved paths, mothers hurriedly gathered their children from the playgrounds, and elderly couples cut their walks short, turning down side streets to avoid him. At the supermarket, the security guard held his gaze on Marcus a bit too long, and Marcus could feel watchful eyes tracking his every move as he picked out everyday groceries. One morning, he found a neatly folded note on his doorstep. The white paper bore a short but clear message, written in precise, bold letters. "You don't belong here." Marcus slowly clenched the paper in his fist, taking a deep breath to suppress the rising wave of anger. No signature, no direct threats, just a thinly veiled reminder that his presence was unwelcome. Later that day, he ran into Harold Baxter near the mailbox. "Good morning, Mr. Williams." Baxter greeted him with an icy smile. "How are you finding our little community?" Marcus decided to take the opportunity. "Wonderful," he replied with polite restraint. "In fact, I've already been thinking about ways to enhance the neighborhood. For example, adding better lighting along the park trails." Baxter let out a low chuckle, pretending to consider the suggestion. "Oh, we already have an excellent committee that handles these matters," he said smoothly. "We prefer to let knowledgeable people make those decisions." His tone was overly friendly, but the look in his eyes betrayed his true feelings. "You must be quite busy with work, Mr. Williams. I hope you're comfortable in your new home." Marcus clenched his jaw but didn't let it show. "I'm a professional urban planner," he said deliberately. "This neighborhood was part of one of my projects. I helped design it." Baxter's expression shifted for a fleeting moment, surprise, perhaps even discomfort, before he quickly recovered. "Oh, really?" he drawled, his smile thin and disingenuous. "Well, I'm sure you have respectable experience. But you see, everything here is already set up just right." As Baxter walked away, Marcus felt the thick tension hanging in the air. He always knew prejudice didn't reveal itself openly. It seeped through the cracks, in subtle looks, in carefully chosen words, in the smallest of actions. That evening brought another unpleasant encounter. As Marcus parked his car in front of his house and walked toward his porch, an irritated voice called out from behind him, "Excuse me, but you can't park that close to the sidewalk." Marcus turned to see a man in his 50s with an authoritative demeanor and a smug expression. It was his next-door neighbor, Richard Banks, one of the oldest residents in Silver Oaks. "Good evening," Marcus said calmly. "I'm parked within the permitted distance." Banks sighed, crossing his arms. "Maybe that's how things are done where you're from," he smirked. "But we have our own standards here. We like to keep things tidy." Marcus held his gaze, refusing to be intimidated. "I understand. Thank you for letting me know. I'll make sure to review the community guidelines." Banks nodded with a satisfied smirk, but his eyes sent a different message. "You don't belong here." Stepping inside his house, Marcus took off his jacket and let out a long breath. It was clear they would seize every opportunity to make his life uncomfortable, hoping he would eventually leave. But Marcus wasn't one to back down. The next day, he decided to go all in. He attended the neighborhood association meeting in person to present his ideas for improving the community. The meeting was held in the grand hall of the local clubhouse, where influential residents, those used to dictating the rules, gathered around long mahogany tables. As Marcus entered, a tense silence fell over the room. He felt the weight of their stares, the silent judgment. Some exchanged glances, others openly scrutinized him with thinly veiled contempt. But he stood tall, refusing to let their hostility shake him. "Good evening," he began, handing out copies of his proposals. "I may be new here, but I can already see how a few improvements could make this neighborhood even better." The residents took the papers without enthusiasm. Some flipped through them absent-mindedly, others set them aside without even looking. "Why do we need changes?" a voice called out from the back of the room. "Everything here works just fine." "Because it can be better," Marcus replied confidently. "Your property values could increase by 20% with some strategic upgrades, better lighting, enhanced landscaping, and improved roadways." A few residents exchanged intrigued glances, but Harold Baxter interrupted with a thin-lipped smile. "We appreciate your enthusiasm, Mr. Williams," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "But we prefer to handle things our own way." Marcus remained composed, offering a calm smile. "I understand," he said, placing a document on the table. "But perhaps it's worth listening to the person who actually designed this neighborhood." His words landed like a thunderclap. Several people frowned in confusion. Others leaned in, suddenly more interested. "What? Are you saying you worked on this project?" someone muttered. Marcus nodded and opened his file, displaying blueprints and official contracts. "Yes," he said firmly. "I was the lead urban planner for the Silver Oaks development. I oversaw the infrastructure planning, zoning approvals, and design implementation." A stunned silence fell over the room. Even Baxter's usual smug expression faltered for a split second. Marcus looked around, letting the information sink in. He knew they saw him differently now, not just as an intruder, but as someone who had a legitimate stake in this community. Crossing his arms, he smiled and said, "I'm here to stay, ladies and gentlemen. So why not work together to make this place even better?" Marcus sat at the large oak table in the Silver Oaks clubhouse conference room, carefully observing the faces of those around him. The dim lighting created an atmosphere of exclusivity, an elite club where everyone knew their place. At the far end of the table sat Harold Baxter, his hands clasped tightly, lips pressed into a thin line. Other members of the committee, Mr. and Mrs. Banks, Mr. Lawrence, a well-known attorney, and Mrs. Rivera, the owner of a chain of boutiques, exchanged curious glances. They were all waiting for Marcus to explain himself. "So, Mr. Williams," Baxter finally spoke, his voice pompous and cold. "You claim to be, what was it again? An urban planner?" Marcus met his gaze with unwavering confidence. "Yes, that's correct." He placed a folder on the table, filled with blueprints, contracts, and visual plans of the neighborhood. "Here are the documents that confirm my work on the Silver Oaks project. I developed this community from the ground up." Baxter leaned forward, scanning the documents, though he made no effort to hide his skepticism. "Interesting," he muttered, flipping through the papers. "Never thought someone like you would have worked on such a prestigious project." A heavy silence filled the room, thick like a storm cloud before the rain. Marcus felt his pulse quicken but kept his face composed. He knew the power of patience. He just needed to give them time to process the truth. "Perhaps it's time to adjust your expectations," Marcus said coolly. "Not only did I work on this project, but I also led the negotiations with the city on infrastructure planning." Mr. Lawrence, who had been silent until now, adjusted his glasses and leaned in. "Infrastructure?" he asked, intrigued. "Are you saying you had a hand in how our roads and utilities were set up?" "Exactly," Marcus replied, spreading out a large schematic. "For example, this drainage system here. It's the reason your basement stayed dry during heavy rains, and this," he pointed to another section, "was supposed to be an additional park, but budget cuts eliminated it from the final plan." Baxter's jaw tightened. Marcus could see it, the realization that his authority was slipping. "That's all well and good, Mr. Williams," Baxter said, his voice dripping with forced politeness. "But the residents here expect a certain level of comfort. Your plans are interesting, but who's to say we even need these so-called improvements?" Marcus let a small smile touch his lips and leaned forward. "These aren't just plans," he said firmly. "They're future investments. The upgrades I propose could increase your property values by 20%, not to mention the added convenience and security for your families. Are you really willing to pass up that opportunity?" A murmur spread across the room. Mrs. Rivera whispered something to her husband, while Mr. Banks frowned, considering the numbers. Then, from the corner of the room, a voice Marcus hadn't heard before cut through the tension. "I've heard of you, Mr. Williams," said Peter Hudson, a prominent investor and one of the first residents of Silver Oaks. He removed his glasses and studied Marcus closely. "Your name has come up in a few city development meetings. Why didn't you mention your background earlier?" Marcus met his gaze steadily. "Because I don't believe in introducing myself with a resume," he said. "I prefer to let my work speak for itself. But now that I see my experience can be valuable here, I'm willing to step up." The room's atmosphere shifted. Marcus could sense that some of them were beginning to see him differently, not as an intruder, but as a potential asset. But Baxter wasn't ready to concede defeat. He crossed his arms and smirked. "We'll take your suggestions under advisement, Mr. Williams," he said curtly. "But remember, this community values tradition." Marcus didn't flinch. "I understand tradition," he replied. "But progress and tradition don't have to be enemies. They can work together." He gathered his documents slowly, making sure they all had a chance to digest his words. As he walked toward the door, he heard Mr. Banks whisper to Baxter, "Damn it, Harold. He might actually have a point. Maybe we should at least hear him out." Stepping outside into the crisp evening air, Marcus looked out at the well-manicured streets he once envisioned on paper. He knew this was just the beginning. They now knew who he was, and he wasn't going anywhere. Several months had passed since that fateful neighborhood meeting where Marcus revealed his role in the creation of Silver Oaks. The neighbors were still wary of him, but no one openly tried to push him out of the community anymore. Instead, they chose to ignore him, hoping he would eventually feel out of place and leave on his own. But Marcus was different. He wasn't going anywhere. Instead, he continued working on improvement projects for the neighborhood, despite the passive resistance from the local elites. Then came the day when he finally got the chance to prove just how much they needed him. Early one morning, a frantic knock on his door startled him. When he opened it, a visibly nervous man in a work uniform stood outside. "Good morning, sir. Sorry to bother you, but we have an issue with the water system. The groundwater levels are rising too quickly, and it looks like the drainage system is about to fail." Marcus nodded calmly, though inside his mind was racing. "Where's the problem?" "In the park, sir. The district management is already there, and Mr. Baxter insists that we shut down several streets immediately." Marcus wasted no time and headed straight to the site. He knew situations like this didn't allow for delays. When he arrived at the park, a small crowd of concerned residents had already gathered. In the center of the commotion stood Harold Baxter, waving his hands dramatically in front of the engineers, clearly out of his depth. "We need to shut down the road completely," Baxter was insisting loudly. "It's the only way to prevent flooding in the area." Marcus quickly assessed the situation, his eyes scanning the schematics the engineers were holding. "That's not necessary," he said firmly, stepping forward. All eyes turned to him, and Baxter scowled. "And what exactly do you suggest, Mr. Williams?" Baxter sneered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Are you going to save us with your brilliant ideas?" Ignoring the sarcasm, Marcus addressed the workers directly. "Show me the key water accumulation points and the rising levels over the past few hours." The engineers, sensing his authority, immediately spread out the plans and reports. "Here," Marcus pointed at the blueprint. "If we install temporary pumps at these 2 points, we can divert the water before it reaches critical levels." One of the engineers nodded, reviewing the calculations. "That could work," he admitted. Marcus turned to Baxter, who was now looking increasingly frustrated. "This solution will save the neighborhood tens of thousands of dollars," Marcus added. "And it won't require shutting down any streets, so your precious morning joggers won't be inconvenienced." A murmur spread through the crowd. Some residents nodded, recognizing the logic in Marcus's plan. "That sounds reasonable, Harold." Mrs. Rivera, the boutique owner, spoke up. "Maybe we should listen?" Baxter clenched his jaw, clearly feeling his authority slipping away. "Fine," he muttered, waving a hand. "Do as he says." Marcus didn't gloat. He simply took charge of the situation. Within hours, the pumps were installed and the flooding threat was neutralized without any unnecessary disruptions. As the last of the water drained away, residents began approaching Marcus one by one, offering quiet words of thanks. "Thank you, Mr. Williams," an elderly woman said sincerely. And, "I'm sorry if we weren't exactly welcoming to you before. You've shown us that you truly care about this place." Marcus smiled gently. "I just want this neighborhood to be the best it can be," he replied. The next morning, the Silver Oaks Times featured an article on its front page, "Expert Intervention Prevents Disaster," accompanied by a photo of Marcus overseeing the operation. Even Baxter, while walking past Marcus's house later that day, begrudgingly admitted, "Perhaps I misjudged you, Williams." Marcus simply smiled. "We're all learning, Mr. Baxter." That evening, as Marcus sat on his porch, watching families stroll through the park he had once envisioned, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The children played freely, the neighbors walked their dogs, and he knew his presence had made a difference. He realized that victory wasn't about gaining their approval, but about standing his ground and proving he belonged, not just with words, but with actions. He stayed. He won.